What's up, future shredlords? Welcome back. Death to the fingers. I'm sure a lot of people were kind of confused about the revelation of chords video with respect to the piano. And I'm just trying to set something up here because we're going to do another video like that, but I have now a piece of software that lets you see it on the guitar. And so you can kind of watch those two videos and see how this concept works. And that's really why I'm trying to bridge the gap here with this video. The idea of having less reliance on things like scales and arpeggios and chord progressions and just chord charts and stuff like that, which tends to rigidly constrain you, creatively speaking, and instead seeing how you can start to take some of the base mechanics that we use to create a scale, a chord, or arpeggio sequence, and then use that in a new and more creative way to sort of enhance that knowledge and take it in a new direction. Because that sort of rekindles the learning experience. Otherwise, you end in this sort of practice purgatory or hell, depending on, how progressed along you are in your entrenchment. But music feels like a chore and not something that's fun to do anymore. And obviously that's a situation that has to be avoided at all costs. But there's this, fundamental acceptance too, that just to get better at music requires this sort of unpleasant task, if you will, of just grinding away on the fretboard too. So it's kind of a paradox. But ultimately, the thing is that we start to rely on scales and, licks and internet lessons and all the rest of that stuff to define our practice sessions. And instead of us embracing who we are, what our strengths are, our weaknesses, that's what I mean by that. Who is you? Yeah. Who are you as a guitar player really is largely defined by you, right? But how do you find you if you're basically playing mostly, carbon copies or facsimiles of other people's stuff? Another paradox, right? You haven't taken that and sort of internalized it and sort of spat it out in your own sort of creative way. Kind of like how a mathematician absorbs another mathematician's formula and then just uses it as a leaping off point to do something else that's really important, that fills in another piece of the puzzle. Right? So you have to look at that experience in much the same way, and I don't see people doing that, which is why we're kind of getting this weird homogenized form of music, whether it's pop music, rock music, metal, or anything really. It's starting to boil down to like some really, really, sad tropes and stereotypes where you're just like, really? Now listen, some of it's catchy and pretty interesting, the first few listens, but it's like, when you eat Fruit Loops, when you eat it as a kid, you're like, this is the best day ever. And then when you're an adult, you get this weird craving and you eat it again. And yeah, I get it. It's different. But at the same time, you're just like, this is not nearly as satisfying as I thought it was going to be. It's just empty calories. It's not even healthy. It's more damaging, right? So that's the point is you think it's good. You think the experience is going to be great. And it's worth revisiting and all the rest of that stuff. And it's kind of a desperate cry to be like, I just need something to break up the monotony. But ultimately what happens is that it just ends up being sort of an exercise in futility because you don't really get something from that either. I know this well. I used to fall back on this crutch all the time to be like, well, just learn another scale system. Or I'll try to integrate these two more deeply or whatever it is. Or I'll learn like a whole bunch of new chord shapes and then try to figure out, clever ways of making chord progressions or whatever it is, or sprucing up other ones. But of course, it just kind of comes out as either musical nonsense or gibberish, or more important, because you just don't know how to use these complex forms, and that's totally normal. Of course, you're just like unknown territory as far as I'm concerned. So I'm just throwing everything at the wall and hoping something might stick. Right? And you can keep doing that, but that's just it. Once you get to that level, you either know or you don't know. So basically, most of the time that you're doing it, it'll end up in failure because you just don't know. And you have to. At that level, you have to. You have to be able to put your finger on it and be like, that's the thing I have to do right now. That will work. And let's face it, that's that takes years to sort of get there. So again, you see this over-reliance on the scale systems and everything else. Instead of trying to understand their mechanics in the bigger picture, you know, we have words, we have whole dictionaries full of words, but then we have a whole bunch of rules for stringing those words together. So that's what I'm talking about. We have scales and arpeggios and music concepts like perfect cadences and, you know, the melodic minor and all this other stuff. But at the end of the day, there's not a whole lot in terms of, you know, how to speak this language, how to use these elements and tools, musically speaking, to really, you know, bring a piece of music to life and make people be like, yeah, that's amazing. Like, it happens sometime, obviously, but not always. And that's just it. I didn't quite understand that for a very, very, very long time. I was a competent player. I could play covers and do solos and play fast and do it well. But everything I was saying was always sort of lacking. You know what I mean? You'll get there. You'll be like, yeah, there's the magic is missing. And it was the spontaneity and the ability to just do what I wanted to do. I was repressed as a guitar player. I was oppressed. So, you know, you have to find a way to break out of that. And it's developing your mind. When I was working on 1-4-5 chord progressions, that basically led me to the concept of triad pairs, because I saw another video that was just talking about using the 4 and 5 triads from a major scale and in different ways. And I'm like, okay, well, this is probably useful to know with respect to this 1-4-5 chord progression. You know what I mean? So that's what I'm saying is like it started off with just being able to play the chords, then understanding how to string them together using this basic chord progression and sort of how it works musically. You know, the importance of the 1 chord, the 4 chord, and the 5 chord in a major scale or a minor scale in this case, obviously minor. 1-4-5, I don't think. Maybe it does. I don't know. You know, I never actually tested the theory out, so I won't say that, but who knows? The point being here is that led to, of course, this really powerful tool called triad pairs, which can then be used in conjunction with things like superimposition. And you can get absolutely devastating effects using that. And then you can take it a step further by, again, breaking down these triad pairs. Instead of just using the triads, you can stack 2 different types of triads on top of each other to create a more complex chord, which has these 2 different flavors. You know what I mean? So instead of it just being 2 adjacent shapes, now all of a sudden you're using 2 sort of arpeggio shapes that complement each other to express this sound. So that's what I'm talking about, thinking out of the box. At first, you're just like, oh, play the 1-4-5. And so you're like, I'll do it in all 12 keys. I'll learn 500 songs that use the 1-4-5 chord. But then at the end, you're just like, I sound like one of those 400 songs that I was just playing. And you have no way really to sort of start to explore your own ideas, which can be very restrictive, even if you're not going to record them. It doesn't matter if you're going to actually make an official recording or do any type of recording whatsoever. You just want to be able to sit down and make some music, not practice the guitar. The making of the music part is the practicing. The learning how to play things on the guitar, scales, arpeggios, chords, caged, all of it. That is a means to an end. The actual practice session is you trying to refine your skills as a musician, creating music on your particular instrument, in this case, guitar. Which means you have to fundamentally understand some of the raw materials, if you will, of how to create some of these things like chords and scales and arpeggios. Obviously, chords and arpeggios are effectively, you know, opposite sides of the same coin. One is where you just play all the notes simultaneously, and the other one's where you do it sequentially. But that serves as a leaping off point, right? You can do it in reference to caged. You can do it in reference to the diatonic scale using caged. And so it goes from being like these two separate ideas to merging into one idea. And then once you get there, you start to expand that knowledge base. That knowledge turns into wisdom, which is what allows you to play music. Most people think that this surface knowledge, the ability to play some scales and stuff like that, is going to instantly transform their playing to this, you know, God tier status where you could just shred it up over a backing track and it sounds amazing. Like a Guthrie or a John Petrucci situation, or insert any amazing guitar player in there, whoever you think is great. It doesn't really matter, you know? But that's my point. It just really doesn't. Because you're going to see a video and be like, learn how to play this person's guitar style exactly, right down to his amp settings. And that was it. It was a Nuno Betancourt interview. I think it was maybe Rick Beato. Maybe it wasn't. I can't remember. Could have been Guitar Rig or something like that. But he was talking about, you know, trying out Eddie's rig. And he's like, I don't sound anything like you, even though I'm playing through your rig. He's like, yeah, of course, it's all in the hands, man. You know, Eddie knew. Eddie just knew. That's why he was so great. Now, there's a person that understood the assignment. You know, like, be original, innovate, never sort of like fall back on your laurels. Although you could say that later on in the career, they kind of, you know, fell off the edge a little bit there, but still he was just trying to do his thing. And with his body of work for the first like 8 albums, you know, come on. It was just when he started to do the Foreign Lawful stuff and he started to cop Paul Gilbert's, you know, use of the drill. That's when I was just like, you know, Steve Stevens with the toy gun kind of did it first. Then Paul, you know, quickly brought it up and took it up a notch with the triple pick drill. I remember seeing that in the guitar magazines. And then, of course, Eddie doing it afterwards to get that sound from Pound Cake. So it's cool or whatever, but not as cool as when Dimebag was doing that octavizer, you know, on things like Becoming or whatever. And a great other song, a great many other songs like that. So, I mean, honestly, the thing is we've gone from that sort of like forward-thinking mentality, making new sounds, sort of breaking apart the old traditions. That's what I learned from Steve Morse about live rig stuff. He's just like, you know, the traditional approach is just have a paddle board and all the rest of that stuff, and it just goes into your amp, and when you want delay, you just hit this pedal and stuff like that. He got thinking about it. He's just like, well, here's my standard amp sound, but then he's like, I want to do like a, you know, like a stereo output of that guitar sound that goes into a whole nother, you know, signal chain for effects with a volume pedal. And also, I think he had an expression pedal in there too. So it was 2 levels of actual blending he could do with a whole nother amp rig designed to sort of enhance his original sound with this new sound by just bringing in the volume. And I was just like, damn, you know, like that's a pretty cool idea. Especially when you're talking about going from like a heavy situation, playing distorted where it's loud, but then you just drop out with the cleans. You could just quickly scoot over and dial it in. It would just make it bloom up massively in the live context. So it makes a lot of sense. And then if you're like, oh, it's a little too much, dial it back or whatever it is, a little bit more. You know, like that's just genius. It's being able to be dynamic in a live situation without constraints. And just think you could do that now with just 2 pedals, like a Line 6 floor model, just for the sake of argument, and then one of their little effects models. You know what I mean? Like you're talking like, I don't know, maybe $5,000, which is nothing. Just a decent amp head is 5 Gs or more. So bottom line is you got to think outside the box. sometimes you have to take traditionalism, I should say, into account. You can't just ignore the history of stuff, you know. We're not changing amps and guitars and all the rest of that. You know what I mean? You can have an amp modeler and all the rest of that, but James Hetfield still has an amp on stage that he can hear himself being, you know, playing out of and whatnot. And it's true. The in-ear stuff, it's great and all the rest of that, but at the end of the day, it's probably not nearly as cool or as gratifying, if you will, as just kind of turning up the 412 and just rocking out with the boys. You just got to have enough space where the air can get at it, you know what I mean? So it's not so, you know, thunderous and taking your head off kind of situation, but it is what it is. I understand the necessity. But again, you have to sort of temper things where you're like, okay, I got to learn scales. I have to incorporate this technical information, but at the same time, I have to find creative ways to actually practice it and then employ it. So I move towards more of a musician context rather than just a practice machine, you know, that has like these insane shred chops. Yeah, I can get it out. Right. So, I mean, that's where it starts to fall apart. So develop your mind. Think about what it is that you're doing. Break down these ideas. Take a look at when you're sort of playing a triad. Even ask yourself to be like, well, what is the G-type triad if I were to break it down? What inversion's this one? What inversion's the next one? And then start on that set of strings, whether it's the low E string or the A string or the D string or even up to the G string, and then start climbing up using that chord cluster, if you will, in terms of major, minor, and diminish using the diatonic scale. And then you can start stacking them on top of each other. That alone would take a person like 2 or 3 years to fully map out. Just the diatonic scale. Just those 7 positions. Because that is an absolute ridiculous amount of actual... You got the 3, bare minimum 3 sort of cage positions. So right there, 3 times, that's 21 just for one group of strings. Multiply that by 4. And then remember how to stack them all back and forth. And let me tell you, I've tried myself and it just becomes like crazy. But there it is. You just keep, you know, working away at it. And of course, what you really want to do when you're doing stuff like that is just train your ear. Again, you kind of heard me doing that a little bit more with, I guess you could say it was a bit more sophisticated than just playing a drone note and then working on some chords, ascending using the fretboard and whatnot. But it is the same principle itself. Instead of, just one note, I was using either an interval like a 5th or a 6th or a 7th or something, or I was using a full-on triad, or maybe even, the shell voicing where it was like 1-5-1, so I have the octave in there. That's important. Not only just breaking the things down and understanding their mechanics and whatnot, but then seeing how that relationship translates right directly to the fretboard. Again, those are the things that made me sort of aware and able, if you will, to sort of quickly adapt my mindset to be like, oh, do this. I want to play a major arpeggio, but I don't want to just, do like this. I want to do it kind of like more involved. And of course, beforehand, I was just running into the wall. I'm like, I don't know how. And I couldn't even figure out how to come up with an exercise that would allow me to accomplish that task. And that was the problem. I couldn't think outside the box unless somebody was showing me. And that's when I was like, oh, that's a major level mental crutch. So when I kind of threw away the guide rails and just used them as like tools, I'm like, okay, learn this stuff because it's important. These are the big ones. Learn all this stuff. Then it became important to me to basically use this stuff in a context that I thought made sense musically. So in doing that, essentially what you do is get a much firmer grasp and confidence in using the element because it just makes sense to you. And listen, you can tell when something's being played correctly and when it's just a total train wreck. So it's not like you can kind of lie to yourself. You're like, that either works or it doesn't. Now, listen, there's a lot of gray area there in terms of interpretation. But if you like it, sure, why not? basically there's millions of guitar players out there that play weird stuff. John Scofield's like that. Yeah, it's just you're just like, bro, what happened? What? Alan Holdsworth's another one. It's just like, what? Where did that go? Where did it come from? Just gone. Right. So that's the thing. You don't have to be like as outside and as adventuresome, if you will, as those guys, but you have to understand how to break out of these sort of cages, mentally speaking, where it's so rigid and regimented that it just stifles and kills the creative inner child, if you will, for lack of a better word. And that's very bad, because soon the challenge of the technicality will wear off. And then all you're left with is just this ability to play fast, but what you're playing just doesn't engage you anymore because you can't really change it up. And that right there is the kiss of death. So you've invested 10 years into playing guitar and then just be like, nah, I'm done, quit. Or maybe 20, because you can't adapt. That's why it's important to basically develop your mind at the same time and be like, okay, developing my mind means I'm playing this G-type chord in the closed position, and now I'm going to basically dissect this chord. It's a major third interval there. Oh, there's a minor third. Oh, I'm playing this bar across here. That comes from the A-type chord, so that's 1-5. So that's a 5-1-3 kind of situation, right? That's a second inversion when I bar across there, and you start making these mental notes over and over and over again. And trust me, by doing that, you're like, oh, if I'm starting on the 5 here, how far do I have to move up in terms of frets to get back to the 1 chord? And you're like, that number of frets is this interval. You see what I mean? You start to develop the sense to use the music terminology to act as a shortcut to just quickly express your idea. Instead of being like, oh, I got to move up 9 frets. You're just like, I'm jumping up this interval structure, go up a 6th. And boom, it's not 9 frets, but you get my point. Okay? There's I don't know, there's some sort of process of familiarity that the human being goes through when you start to just use like this terminology that's used over and over and over again, and it just starts to sink in, and then you start to see it everywhere, whether it's on 1 string, 2 strings, across a couple strings where you jumping over one, string skipping essentially. That stuff right there is absolutely crucial in your development, and a lot of times it just gets completely ignored because people are very, very sort of reticent, if you will, to explore their own creativity because they're just not very good at it at the start. And so they get discouraged and they're just like, well, I suck or whatever it is, without realizing it takes decades or years at least to get anywhere close to just being able to make a coherent, solo or musical sentence, if you will. So, there's no shame in sort of being like, well, I haven't really got there yet. It took me 25 years before I actually played a solo, and I was like, that was pretty damn good. 25. I was like, before I was like, yeah, the technique's there, definitely, but the solos themselves were like, yeah, it's okay. It's just me throwing some ideas together. I knew it. I was cheating myself. I already knew it. I already knew that I was cheating myself by being like, yeah, I know. I played it fast and everything like that, but I do that all the time. That's not challenging. And then, of course, there was no thought process. It's just play fast all the time. And that's supposed to cover over for, a lack of actually saying anything worthwhile musically. It wasn't until way later when I got fed up with just being, sort of ineffective in that capacity, that I was like, okay, kick it up a notch. And that's when I started to think like a musician. And that made all the difference. So it took me from being relatively zero-ish to kind of hero-ish, at least in my own mind. Now I could sort of explore these more complex music ideas and apply them to the fretboard and not feel like a total dork because I was lost in the weeds. And this is coming from a guy who already actually had a pretty serious theory background. For some reason, I just couldn't scan, couldn't translate. So that was the fundamental shift. And it's not like, oh, learn a bunch of music theory or anything else like that. It's like, have attention to detail, almost like Sherlock Holmes. That's his superpower. He can dissect the situation by his acute sense to pay attention to detail. So when you're playing a triad, it's not just 3 notes. There's a group of relationships there based on the key, based on a whole bunch of different things. Is it the 1 chord, the 4 chord, the 5 chord? You know what I mean? Like, is it a major triad, minor triad, diminished or augmented? When to use augmented, when to use diminished, when to use major and minor? What's the sequence when it's a minor scale, when it's a major scale, when it's the Dorian mode? All of that stuff actually matters. And listen, they all basically intersect on the same lines. So it sounds complicated, but honestly, you're just recycling the same 4 or 5 pieces of information over and over and over again, and using that as a template to basically decode the fretboard. But if you can't see it up here in your mind, you're going to be hard pressed to actually accomplish that stuff on the actual fretboard. So it doesn't matter how many scale exercises you do, or how many arpeggio etudes you play, or how many chord progressions or cover songs you learn. You won't get better as a musician. You'll technically get better as a guitarist. But that elusive sort of ability to just do something musically in the moment, just sit down at an instrument, play your guitar, play the piano, whatever that is, will always be just slightly beyond your grasp. And it'll always be a certain measure of, well, I'm not really sure what the next chord is, or you can't hear it in your head. Right? So that's why it's really important to start to marry all this information up, because again, at the end of the day, it creates a pathway for you to cut through all the bullshit and just keep learning, which is essential. You have to keep expanding the ideas that you learn. Cage starts off as just 5 simple chords, and it gets built into a cathedral of an idea with respect to how those chords interact, how to use them with respect to superimposition, you know, the structure, makeup, how they intersect with the various arpeggios, etc., etc., etc. And it starts with just doing this one thing, but of course, it's the creative mind that allows you to take that one thing, the 5 chords, and start building it up exactly the same way that you would start off in kindergarten being like 1 + 1 = 2. And by the time you're hitting university, it's like this integral approaching infinity plus this integral approaching negative infinity equals this over here. And it's some super complex math sort of function. The addition sort of is still the same. Take this thing and add it to that. But now the actual 1 + 1 has been replaced by some absolutely ridiculous math function that barely anybody can solve or even remember how to solve. And that's my point. It's not that the mathematician has any sort of great skill. He just knows how to decipher this sort of math function. Everybody knows what addition means. That's the difference, right? So a lot of people know how to do caged, just like they can add 1 + 1. But as soon as you start applying caged in more sort of sophisticated music ways, like using caged to do triad pairs, well, now all of a sudden you've increased the complexity by like orders of magnitude. And that's my point. Is the simple ideas become incredibly complex, but you can't learn that stuff by watching a video. You got to sit there, you got to practice it and play it, and you got to understand it on your own terms, and then figure out how to use it the best way you know how. Otherwise, it'll always come out sounding like music gibberish, and it's like, it'll sound weird. So that's the video. On Thursday, we're going to go over the same idea with respect to the revelation of chords, but with the guitar program now. And I'm going to show you how to start layering these intervals and doing chord sections and stuff, building them up, so you can understand some of the very ideas that I showed you on the guitar, but also now showed across 2 different instruments, showing the very basic principle as it's applied in both worlds achieve basically killer results, and you don't have to be some super genius to be able to figure that one out. Right. Good times. We'll see you in the next one.